Greetings all. So as you know, we're doing a series of asynchronous lectures to make up for the class that we missed on October 5th. So this is the first of several of those lectures. Before we jump back into the material, just a quick reminder that your outlines and topic paragraphs are due to me by this coming Monday. We can talk about that again in class on Monday, but they're due anytime during the day or evening that day, all the way up until 12 midnight. I've received a bunch of them already. Thank you. And I'm hoping that I'll get all of the rest by Monday evening. As you know, we were right in the middle of talking about the case of Jimenez versus Lee. We spent a little bit of time at the end of class talking about the difference between legal title and equitable title. That's a very important distinction in trust law. And it really helps us understand what trusts are. So that's absolutely a key concept, and I think that's where we left off. So picking back up with the case, Jason, of course, knew that the bond was supposed to be held in trust. He wrote to his own mother that he holds the funds, quote, in trust, and he's a lawyer, so he understands the concepts. If he held the funds in trust, then the purchase of stock does not really change the holding into a custodial holding under the Uniform Gift to Minors Act, as the case explains, right? That attempt to kind of broaden his power would be violative of his fiduciary duty to Betsy to administer the trust solely in her best interest. And we should just reflect for a second on why it is that that shift would in fact broaden his power. And I think the case explains this well. So under the Uniform Gift to Minors Act, if that were the case, if that were the context, Jason would have the power to use the property as he sees fit for the general benefit of a minor, for the general benefit of Betsy, right? The UGMA gives that kind of discretion to the holder of the asset. But as a trustee of an educational trust, right, by contrast, he only has the power to use the funds for educational purposes, and he must give a clear accounting of the monies, showing that the funds were used only for those purposes. So the duties are much more robust, right? He's much more limited in what he can do. So if that were the case, Betsy could impose a constructive trust or an equitable lien on the stock. Also, the duty to keep full, accurate, and orderly records is absolutely essential under trust law, and Jason did not do that. He somewhat lamely tries to defend himself by pointing to a summary of expenditures which he claimed were for Betsy's benefit. He pointed to a 1966 letter to Betsy after her 21st birthday, disclosing the gifts to her and suggesting that she used the funds to cover her ballet classes. And he tries to get credit for spending part of the funds on items that really had little or nothing to do with her education. And in some cases, the money wasn't even spent on Betsy, right? It was for himself or other family members. So the case is remanded for an accounting based on the duty to account and on the trustee's burden to prove that the expenditures were made for trust purposes. So the case really has a lot of good lessons about trust law. Not only does it explain the difference between legal title and equitable title, as we discussed, but it really goes into some detail about the difference between the UGMA and holding the money in trust, and then the various obligations that he had, including the duty to keep books and records and the duty to do an accounting, to account for the funds. So that's it for the Jimenez versus Lee case. We'll talk about the Estate versus Janes case. I then think we'll have to skip the Marsman versus NASCA case because I want to get to the material for the fifth itself and not spend too much time on previous days. But let's just talk for a few minutes about Estate of Janes. So another interesting trust case. Has some interesting concepts that we've briefly mentioned, but not in a lot of detail. So Rodney Janes, in this case, prepared a will and a codicil, leaving his assets to 3 different trusts, right? Very common. A marital deduction trust with 50% of his assets, the income from which would be paid to his wife for her life, during her life, a charitable trust, right? Secondly, a charitable trust with 25% of his assets, and then a third trust with the balance of the assets for Mrs. Janes, and then the remainder for a charitable trust on her death. So three different trusts were established. Lincoln Rochester Trust, an institution, is the trustee. In 1973, Lincoln recommends raising cash for administrative expenses, which is understandable, and it wants to do that by selling Kodak stock, right? So stock in the old Kodak company. And in a 1973 meeting with Lincoln, Mrs. Janes consents, of course, to the sale of 1,200 shares of Kodak stock. Around the same time, the price of Kodak starts falling, right? Eventually it's down by 2/3, which is a rather precipitous decline. In 1980, Lincoln performs an accounting, and Mrs. Janes objects to what Lincoln comes up with, and the Attorney General, right, the AG, on behalf of the charities that are part of the trust we just mentioned, objected as well, claiming that Lincoln violated the prudent person rule of investing. So this case is just as much about investing and the prudent person rule as it is about trusts, and we'll see the two concepts dovetail in this case very nicely. After a trial, the surrogate court found that Lincoln should have in fact divested the estate of the high concentration of Kodak stock in 1973. Get rid of that stock, dump it. Too high of a concentration of one stock in these trusts. The appellate division agrees with the lower court, finding Lincoln liable for inattention, inaction, and lack of disclosure, right? They just disagreed a bit on damages, but they agreed that Lincoln was at fault. This court now affirms, right? The case that we are reading for this class affirms that opinion. So Lincoln claims in its defense, the institution, Lincoln Rochester Trust, claims that, well, under New York law, a fiduciary cannot be surcharged. In other words, it cannot be liable for imprudent management for the failure to diversify in the absence of some additional hazard, right? Lincoln basically says a blue chip stock is not imprudent. At that time, the Kodak company, was deemed to be a very solid blue chip company, and Lincoln says we shouldn't be liable. We shouldn't be surcharged for imprudent management for a failure to diversify if we buy a standard blue chip stock in the absence of some additional elements of hazard, some additional problem that didn't exist in this case. However, unfortunately for Lincoln, New York State followed the so-called prudent person rule, which says that a fiduciary holding funds for investment may invest in securities as would be acquired by a prudent person of discretion and intelligence who is seeking a reasonable income and preservation of capital, right? The prudent person rule, a fiduciary holding funds for investment can invest in securities as would be acquired by a prudent person of discretion and intelligence who is seeking a reasonable income and preservation of capital. The court quotes the Talbot case, which uses the phrase, as general men of prudence would employ in their own affairs. Now, one interesting comment about this, there is a difference in these two formulations if you stop and think about it. A prudent person of discretion and intelligence is not necessarily the same as prudence one would employ in managing their own affairs. And we can reflect for a few minutes on why that's true, right? We can talk about that now for a second and maybe pick it up in class on Monday. So a prudent person of discretion and intelligence is an objective test, whereas prudence that one would employ in managing their own affairs is a subjective inquiry. Very different. In any case, the court says there is no precise formula for determining when the prudent person standard has been violated. The very nature of the prudent person rule militates against bright line tests, right? Bright line rules, which is what Lincoln wants. Lincoln wants a bright line rule saying it was a safe stock, it was a blue chip stock, we're not liable. So the question is whether, given all the facts and circumstances, Lincoln violated the prudent person rule on concentration, right? On having too many assets concentrated in one stock, not putting all of your eggs in one basket. The court spends a little bit of time explaining that we should not look upon any one investment in isolation, and rather we've got to look at investments in the context of the entire portfolio. So that was a shift that was, I think, well in place by the time that this case was decided, but it was some time in coming. So according to this theory, it's important to look at each investment not on an isolated basis, but in relation to the entire portfolio. Why is that true? That was a result of some significant changes in investments that were all known under the heading of modern portfolio theory. And the idea, in a nutshell, is that it does not make sense to look at any one individual investment and decide whether it's good or bad. You've got to look at all of the investments that a person or an institution has in its portfolio and determine if the portfolio itself is reasonable. It doesn't make any sense. It's too rigid, it's too wooden to look at any one single investment. So the key here is that Lincoln did not exercise its duty of care, as you can see from the case. Lincoln did not consider the Kodak investment in relation to the entire portfolio. It did not consider the needs and interests of Jane's 72-year-old widow. And generally, Lincoln failed to exercise due care and skill for a few reasons, right? First, it undertook no formal analysis of the estate. It didn't follow its own internal protocols, right? 20% concentration is too high according to Lincoln's own internal protocols, and it didn't follow that. And finally, it did not do more than just routine reviews, right? Court says routine reviews, that's just routine. We expect more from a fiduciary undertaking its duty of care. So for all of these reasons, court concludes that Lincoln did not exercise its fiduciary duty of care, right, and holds them liable for the damages in this case. So that's it for the first segment. When we pick up with the next segment, we're not going to talk about the Marsman case, just not enough time to do everything. We're going to skip ahead to the material for Wednesday, October 5th.